I'm Chelsea of Friday Pattern Company, and this is the Heather Blazer Sew Along, and I'm really excited about this video because I think that the Heather Blazer is something that's really fun to sew and also fun to wear, but it's one of those wardrobe pieces, like a blazer, that is intimidating whether you've been sewing for like, you know, a month or you've been sewing for like 10 years. It can still feel intimidating. So I designed this blazer to be easier to sew, and you know, I kept that in mind when I was filming this because I really want you guys to feel confident making your Heather blazers. So yeah, we're gonna go step by step through preparing to sew and also all of the sewing steps. So we'll show you some things along the way that you may or may not know about, like how to fuse interfacing on, how to do tailor tacks, yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff, and it's really fun. And yeah, this is my, oh, I don't know if I should show you. Is it supposed to be a surprise? I mean, I don't know. Anyway, this is the blazer. It turned out so cute. So I used a cotton linen blend. This is a Japanese imported fabric that I have been trying to get my hands on for a while, but it always sells out. So anyway, I have this, and then the lining is this gorgeous fabric from Melanated Fabrics. That's an online fabric store, and they have really gorgeous stuff. So this has like, this is a rayon, and it has this kind of beautiful texture on it, and it's subtle, but it, you know, it just makes my jacket feel so luxurious. Anyway, I can't wait to take you through the whole thing, and yeah, have fun. So here are our materials. I have an instructions packet printed out. I have my main exterior fabric. I have my lining fabric. We've got interfacing. So this is a knit interfacing that has some stretch to it. And then this is a woven interfacing. See how it looks like a fabric? And these are both fusible, even though you kind of can't tell on camera. So you'll need two types. And then there's my thread. I've got clips and pins, scissors, obviously a seam ripper, and we're ready to go. So first we're gonna fuse interfacing onto our pieces. So you fuse it onto the wrong side of your fabric, and your fusible interfacing will have a gluey side and a not gluey side. So you can test out a little swatch if you're unsure. But the glue side goes down on the wrong side of your fabric, and then you press. And you don't scoot the fabric or the iron back and forth. This is super sped up, but I'm holding each of those spots for like 10 seconds. And I'm using a damp rag, so the rag is wet, and then I'm just pressing along to fuse the interfacing. And you may have to re-wet your rag and come back and do it again. There's a list in your instructions about which pieces get which interfacing, because you have the woven interfacing and the knit interfacing. So follow that guide to just get all of your interfacing fused on. It's a big step, but once it's done, it's done. So next up, we are going to be marking our pattern in all the places where there's a circle or a star on the pattern piece. So I have two layers here that I'm going to be marking at the same time. So I have a needle, thread, I have the thread doubled, and you're going to, so I'm making a size medium, so I stab in right at the medium through both layers, and then pull it back out, and then pull the thread through, but leave a tail that's a few inches long, and then loop back through, and then carefully hold that loop so that it's a, you know, it has a couple inches on it, and then holding both tails, you're gonna pull up and then trim that in between your two layers of fabric, and then trim the loop so you can pull your pattern piece off, and you have the pocket placement on both of your pattern pieces. Next in our prep is notches. So there's a bunch of notches. They're like a little dash on your pattern piece, and they just need you need to just trim in about 1/8 of an inch at each of them. Those are just little reference points. So just line your pattern piece up with your fabric and snip in. Okay, time to sew. Well, almost. So we are going to press the top edge of the pocket under 1/4 of an inch, and then you are going to flip it the opposite way and turn it under at the notches and press again. And then we're just gonna sew down those little sides of the pocket. That's gonna make the top of our pocket really nice and clean. Okay, so now that we have those little stitches, we're going to clip our corners and then we're gonna flip this right side out. And then it's back to the iron. So we'll grab our iron and we will flip this right side out and press it. And then you're gonna press the sides of your pockets under 3/8 of an inch on both sides and then also the bottom. After we're done with this pressing, we're gonna edge stitch across this that top folded edge 1/8 of an inch from the fold. And you're gonna repeat this on both pockets. Here is where our tailor tacks come into play. So we are going to line the top of our pocket up with the tailor tacks that we made. And then we'll pin our pocket in place and we're gonna sew down the two sides and across the bottom all in one go. Just make sure you don't sew the top shut. And you're gonna wanna back stitch at the beginning and the end of your pockets. You can add a bar tack or some extra securing stitches at the top corners of your pockets if you want. Some people like that. If you're pretty rough with your pockets, it might be a good idea. Now we're at the machine and I'm just gonna show you how I edge stitch that pocket on. So starting at a corner, we're going to sew just 1/8 of an inch from the edge and then back stitch and then continue down the pocket. And when we get to a corner, we're gonna drop our needle and then lift up our presser foot and pivot our project. And then you can keep sewing. And that's how you get a really nice, clean corner pivot with your stitch. So again, here we are at another corner, drop the needle, lift the foot, turn the project. And then all the way back up to the other side. And then make sure when you get to the top edge of your pocket that you backstitch. Cool, that's looking good. So now we can ditch these tacks. Moving right along to the back. So we've got our back pieces here and we're placing them right sides together, and then we're just gonna sew down this center back seam 3/8 of an inch all the way down and then press that seam open. Now we'll join the front and the back at the shoulder seam. So lay our back piece out and then we'll grab our front piece that we have our pocket sewn onto, and we will put those right sides together and then sew this little seam at the shoulder. Once that's done, you'll press it open and then you'll repeat on the other side. After that, we will join our front to back of the side seams. So we are going to lay them again, right sides together, and matching notches, you're just gonna pin them together at the side seam and sew down using your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then you'll press it open and repeat on both sides. Great, so that's done and we've got a vest. So side seams, shoulder seams, all pressed open, and we're ready to move on to the sleeves. Grab your upper piece F, and on these notches up at the top of your sleeve, you're gonna sew between them using a long straight stitch. So about like 4 to 5 millimeters long. And you're gonna do one row 1/4 inch from the edge and then another row 1/4 inch from that one. Here are those stitches done, and we're gonna use these so that we can ease in the sleeve cap to just give us a nice shape on our shoulder and a little bit of extra range of movement. Now your upper sleeve F will get joined to your lower sleeve G. So we are going to pin them right sides together along this long underarm seam. I mean, I guess you could start with either, but anyway, we're starting here, and make sure that you're matching notches, and you'll just pin or clip and then sew using your 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now you're gonna attach the other side. So again, matching notches, you'll pin the upper to lower sleeve along this seam and it'll match up perfectly. And then you'll use your 3/8 inch seam allowance to sew down. And then after you have these done, you'll press the seam open, both seams open, and you'll repeat on both sleeves. And here's our beautiful sleeve ready to be joined to the body of the jacket. So we're gonna pin the sleeve into the arm side of the jacket. So you've got your sleeve, turn it right side out, and then we can start to pin it in. So you've got a notch on your lower sleeve that will match with your side seam, and then you have multiple notches around the sleeve that will match with different parts of your sleeve and shoulder. So first I start with that underarm seam to the notch on the lower sleeve, and then these notches match on your sleeve. So you've got a single notch in front and a double notch in back. Those match up, and I like to work in kind of a U when I'm pinning in my sleeves. So I'm starting at the bottom and then I'm going up each side toward the cap because the cap needs to be eased in, so we'll do that last. So again, I'm just matching notches and then get that all pinned in place nicely. And the ease on the cap of the sleeve is not a gather. So there aren't actually going to be any puckers. We're just going to pull on these stitches lightly until it's pulled to the size of the arm side, and then we're going to distribute those gathers with our fingers until it's pulled in but there aren't any puckers when we sew. And then we're just going to sew around our arm side using our 3/8 inch seam allowance. Here's our sleeve sewn in, and again, notice I don't have any puckers along the sleeve cap. And then you'll turn it right side out and you're probably going to be able to see some of your gathering stitches that you added. So those will just have to be pulled out with a seam ripper, nice and easy. All right, moving on to the collar. We're just going to join our two under collar pieces together at that center seam. And here we have that seam sewn and pressed open. Now we will join the under collar to the main fabric of your jacket, and you want to make sure that you've got tailor's tacks or some sort of mark at the circles that are on your front pieces, and then also there's 2 circles on your collar. Hi, it's Chelsea. So I somehow goofed when I was filming pinning the under collar to the main fabric, but I did film myself pinning the upper collar to the lining. It's the same thing, so I'm just gonna show it to you here because it's not hard, but it is something you wanna see. So you're about to see the upper collar being pinned to the lining, but pretend it's the under collar being pinned to the main fabric. Okay, bye. So when we pin and then eventually sew our collar to our body, we're sewing between the circle marks, so just mind those. So here I am laying out the body of the jacket, and there's my little circle marks. They're tailor tacks. So we'll do right sides together. We're gonna pin the collar to the body. I'll start at that center back seam, matching the back seam with the collar, and then the notch on the collar matches with the shoulder seam. So we'll match those up next. And then I like to put a pin into the tailor tack and then stick that same pin through the circle mark on the body and pin that in place. So I know that they're perfectly matched up, and I'm just gonna sew to the pin and then to the pin on the other side. So we're just doing that on the other side, matching them up perfectly. Once everything's secure and in place, we'll just head over to our sewing machine. So to make sure that we start at that circle mark, we are going to drop our needle down into the thing, and then I can pull that pin out. And then we'll just sew along the collar at our 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure that your seams stay pressed open at that center back. And then just slow down as you approach the other circle and make sure that you just sew right to it, not past it. Press that seam open and then clip into the seam allowance about 1 inch in from the circle, and then we're ready to move on. Now we'll assemble the lining. So you have your your front facing C, and you're going to join that to your side front lining H. So those match up. They've got notches that you can match, and you're not going to sew all the way to the bottom of this. There's a notch about 3/4 of an inch up from the hem. You're going to stop at that notch. So here I am pinning it, and we'll sew from the top all the way down to that lower notch. And then you'll press that seam open all the way to the hem, and you're going to do this on both sides. Now we'll assemble the back lining. So this gets sewn, we leave an opening in the middle of the back because that's how we're going to turn our jacket right side out. So between those notches you don't sew, so you're going to sew from the top to the notch and then leave it open, and then from the lower notch to the hem. Now we'll press that seam open and we're going to join the back lining to the front lining. And these steps should feel familiar to you because it's the same way that we assembled the main body of the jacket. After the shoulder seams, you're going to repeat that on both sides, and then you're also going to join the side seams and press them open and attach the sleeves. And again, it's just the same method as you did with the main body of your jacket, just with your lining fabric. All right, you've seen this before, but now we're going to join the upper collar to the lining, and this is just a sped up version of what you already saw, but you pin it in and sew between those circles. Once that's done, we'll join the main fabric and the lining at the collar. So just like when we attach the collar, we're going to sew in between the circles. So we're going to drop a pin just right at the circle mark and carefully to make sure they're lined up. And then we'll pin around the collar, and we're going to sew this with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And when you sew, you make sure to push your seam allowance out of the way so that your seam allowance will be able to move back and forth. We don't want to sew on that right now. So here at the machine, you see where the little circle mark is, and we want to just scooch that under and drop our needle directly down on top of it so we know that we have it all lined up. And we're not sewing on our seam allowance from where we attached our collar. When you get to the corners, you can drop your needle and pivot, and then just sew around your collar. And then as you approach that circle on the other side, just slow down and make sure that you get right on top of it. And now we're going to join the lining and main fabric going around the lapel. So we're gonna, again, start at that circle mark, and we're gonna push our seam allowance up so that we're not stitching on top of it. So drop a pin there so you have that perfectly lined up, and then just pin around the lapel, and we're gonna sew all the way down to the hem. And once you have that sewn, just make sure you repeat on both sides, and we are going to clip the corners around the collar. So just clipping away that excess fabric that will prevent our collars from having neat points. So be careful not to trim into your seam. And then we are going to grade our seam. So that means that on the side of the fabric that has that's the main fabric, we are going to trim the seam allowance on that side, just that side, down to a 1/4 inch. And some of the footage of me trimming gets a little bit funky because it's awkward to trim things at this angle. So I'm just carefully trimming down the seam allowance on the main fabric side of the jacket down to a 1/4 inch, and I'm doing this around the collar and then down the front until the notch that is symbolizes your lapel break. So do that on both sides. Time to hem the sleeve. So pull your sleeve out, your main fabric sleeve, and we're going to press the hem of that under 1 3/8 of an inch. So use a ruler, seam gauge to get that, and then just press it nicely in place. Okay, so this step is a little bit weird, but you gotta trust the process because it makes hemming your sleeves really clean and easy. So pull your sleeves inside out, and then you are going to match them up, sliding the lining over the main fabric and pinning it in place around that hem. So you have your main fabric pressed under 1 3/8 inch. So that gives you this little leeway to do this, and then we're going to sew around the sleeve hem using our 3/8 inch seam allowance. And you want to make sure before you sew this that nothing is twisted. So I just kind of compare my side seams and like take a good look at it before you sew. So you're gonna sew around just around that raw edge. And here we have that sewn, and I like to just reach in and pull my sleeve through just to make sure everything went smoothly and nothing got twisted along the way. So I'm just pulling the sleeve back out and feeling it, and it looks good. And then you can kind of see how nice it looks on the inside of your cuff. To keep our sleeve hems from drooping, we're gonna sew seam tacks, which just are little stitches sewn onto the hem of the sleeve to hold the hem in place. So you're with your main fabric still pressed under 1 3/8 of an inch. I'm stitching just a couple little stitches in the seam allowance from the seam we just sewed to the seam allowance of the seams on the sleeve. So none of this is actually going through the main like part of the jacket sleeve. You won't see this from the outside, so it's okay if these stitches are ugly. And then I'm just doing this on both of the seams that are on the sleeve from the 2-piece sleeve, and that'll just hold that hem in place. We have a whole separate video on how to assemble the corners, and I think you should go watch that because it's quite thorough. But now, so go do that, come back here. Now we are closing the hem between the 2 corners that we assembled. So I'm just pinning that in place, and then you're just gonna sew with your 3/8 inch seam allowance. Once that's done, we're gonna do seam tacks on our hem just like we did on the hems of our sleeves. So we're gonna pull the fold up that we have pressed from when we assembled our corners, and we're just going to, drop little stitches on sewing the seam allowance along the hem to the seam allowance in the body of the jacket, and then I'll just keep our hem from drooping. It'll look really nice. And you'll want to add these at each of the side seams and also the center back seam. I'm doing it by hand. I think it's easiest to do it this way, but you can actually kind of scoot this under your machine and do it with your machine if you want. Okay, so we're gonna cut 2 little scraps of fabric that are 1 inch by 1.5 inches wide to make sleeve lining tack strips. This is gonna hold our sleeve lining in place onto our main fabric. So just any little scrap of fabric is fine, and you're just gonna pin it to the, like where the side seam of your body of your jacket meets your sleeve on both your lining and your main fabric. And then we're just gonna do little stitches there in the seam allowance, not on in the body of the jacket, and that just holds your lining in place so it doesn't, drop down in your sleeve. And here's that sewn. Not much to look at, but it's gonna keep our lining nicely in place. Okay, here's the fun part. We're gonna turn our jacket right side out. So I'm just pulling it through and kind of poking all those corners out. And then once I get it through, like pulled right side out, I'm gonna come back with a tool. I use a knitting needle to just kind of poke out all of the corners and just, work around your jacket, making sure all the hems are in place and stuff like that. So here I am just carefully poking out the corners so I have nice crisp corners on my collar and my lapel, just smoothing everything out. And then after you've done all this, you'll take it and you can give it a nice press around, and it's gonna look so good, and you're on your way to Blazer Town. Okay, so there's just a couple little steps left to put the finishing touches on this blazer. So we are going to stitch in the ditch along the collar to hold the 2 collars, the upper collar and the under collar, perfectly in place. So I'm hand sewing this. I think this is probably the cleanest way to do it because you won't see it on the finished garment, and yeah, it has a really professional finish. So just carefully stitching along these lines, just burying your seam inside of the ditch. And this is just a running stitch. It's nothing fancy. So just hand sewing along the collar line. Okay, so now we're just going to close up that lining in the back that we left open so you can pin this shut. And I'm going to do it by machine. So I'm just pinning, and then I'll edge stitch just 1/8 of an inch from this folded edge that I'm making. You could hand stitch this as well, and that would give you just like a super beautiful invisible finish. But yeah, so just get this little area of your jacket closed. Once you have that done, you can just admire it really quick. Ooh, and then sew on the button and the buttonhole. So I have that done here. And yeah, check out your jacket. If you have been sewing along with this video, congratulations on sewing yourself a blazer. And here's mine. I love it so much. I really hope that this sew along was helpful or inspiring for you. You know, sewing can be really empowering and it's something that's really fun. It's a cool way to express yourself and I just love sharing that with people. So I can't wait to do another sew along for you guys and yeah, happy sewing.